What's up, y'all? Sparta here. I want to talk my experience going from a phone that has a Snapdragon 888 and a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. Now, I'm not going to go into the severe benchmarking of it or anything like that. There are thousands of videos by people that actually care about that stuff. I don't care about benchmarks unless it comes to, obviously, the, day-to-day performance of the chip. And I'm just going to detail exactly what I feel about going from an 888 to an 8 Gen 2. Now, specifically, the differences that you can see from going from two generations is that the 888 definitely does get hotter, especially on a phone that doesn't necessarily have any sort of thermal cooling. Like, obviously this phone has HS power control, when I'm talking about any sort of like copper heat pipes or any sort of thermal cooling within the phone to make sure that the phone, as you use it, as you game, doesn't get severely hot. So that's just something that I do feel is important. And the 8 Gen, between these two, this chip is fabricated by Samsung, and Samsung is obviously notorious at this point of making chips that are not that efficient and are not that good at, suppressing heat and throttling and whatnot, or not giving you a good amount of performance without either allowing your phone to go too hot or without it severely throttling. And obviously, if you have a phone like a Red Magic that had an 888 or 888 Plus or a ROG phone, you wouldn't necessarily have to worry about those things, because obviously those phones are gaming phones and they have active cooling. Like, the Red Magic has fans, like actual fans that you could turn on, and I believe the ROG phone does as well. So that's just something you didn't have to worry about. But with people like me that, prioritize cameras and other stuff too, this phone did get quite hot at some points. Was it unbearable? Was it unusable? No. It only really happened when I was gaming, so it wasn't necessarily something that I would sit there and say was like day to day a horrendous thing to experience. But say when it was getting hotter out, like earlier this year when it was like 80, 90 degrees, like 5 days out of the 7 days in a week in Chaska, Minnesota, this phone actually didn't do all that bad. Like, it wouldn't get horrendously hot or anything like that. The phone that would do that was my Pixel 7a. The Pixel 7a would just like tank in performance, which is what I'm recording on right now. And thankfully it's like 40 degrees out right now, so I'm not really gonna be worried about things like, the Pixel 7a overheating, but it's whatever. And obviously this phone is very good for gaming still. The 888 is still a monster. The main issue is the heating. And when you go, and the 8 Gen 1 also had that problem because it was fabbed by Samsung. The 8 Plus Gen 1 didn't, because TSMC took over, and the 8 Gen 2 is also fabbed by TSMC, so you also don't have that issue. But there are also things that the 13 Ultra has. Like, it actually has thermal cooling, and like internal thermal cooling, which is nice, something that you just don't have on here. And it's honestly very nice, because when I play things like the new Devil May Cry mobile game that's in early access or something like that, this phone does get dramatically hotter than this phone does after like 30 minutes. So like, it's not unusable, but it's something that I do want to bring up because obviously it's important. Now, I will bring up HS power control here because it is an important feature that I do believe more phones should have, or, charge separation. HS power control is just what Sony calls it, but charge separation, especially for people that game on their phones, right? The main thing that makes something like HS power control work very nice is that it actually does what it says. It doesn't charge the battery, it just powers the system. And obviously this phone only does like 35, I think it's like 30-watt charging. So it's not the fastest charging phone on the market. I think it's 35, I really don't remember. But I connected to my Xiaomi charger, which is a 90-watt charger, and it charges just fine. And it's something I do wish the Xiaomi had. Now, when you do heavy things on the Xiaomi, like say you like video render or you game, it will charge slower. It does actually throttle how fast the phone is charging, but I would much rather have it to where it just had a charge separation feature in the battery settings, and that's just something that I do feel would have been nice to see, especially since there are other Xiaomi phones that do have it, or not Xiaomi, but the Redmi phones have it. I think the Black Shark phones have it, which are Xiaomi phones that just don't have the Xiaomi label slapped onto it like the 13 Ultra does, or like the 13 Pros or the 13T and T Pros and stuff like that. It would have been nice to see some sort of charge separation feature on this phone too. But in terms of the heating, in terms of like say the phone getting warm, the only times that I've seen have it get warm is when the phone is at a low battery percentage, right? And I'm doing something a little bit more heavy on the phone and it just gets warmer. It doesn't get hot. Or say when you put it on the charger and it's at like 15%, and the phone obviously charges at 90 watts, that's when the phone heats up. That's when the phone warms up. Now, since it's cooler out right now in Minnesota, it's not getting horrendously hot. But I would assume if you're in a place like Texas or all these hot-ass states or even hotter countries, and you get a 13 Ultra or a phone with faster charging than 45 watts, this may end up being an issue. I'm not too sure. But it hasn't really been that big of a deal. At the most, if the phone is too hot, it'll slow down the charging, and then it'll speed back up when the phone cools down. So you don't necessarily have to worry about it overcharging the phone too fast and degrading your battery heavily. So that's something that's very nice. In terms of like day-to-day usage, there really isn't that much of a difference. I'm not gonna lie. The day-to-day usage, this has 16 gigs of RAM, this has 12 gigs of RAM. There's really not much that I would say is like dramatically better about this phone having 4 more gigs of RAM. But I guess in terms of like, I can lock more apps in the background. I mean, the fact that I can lock apps at all is a nice touch. That way, when I clear apps and clear the cache, it doesn't clear the apps that I want to stay open, say like YouTube Music or just YouTube proper or the podcast app or whatever, right? So that's nice, whereas it's just not really a thing on here. At least I don't think. Let me check. Nope, it's just not a thing on here. So that's just something that I wish more manufacturers would do. The last manufacturer I had, obviously, I'm going to bring up that allowed me to do that is LG. What LG did, though, is that they also made it to where you can't swipe the apps away either. Whereas on this, you swipe the apps away, they go away. And that's not necessarily that big of a deal because the moment you reboot the app, it'll stay locked. So if it's still in your app, your recent apps, and you swipe it, whatever, it'll restart all that other crap. But the moment you go back into the app, you don't have to relock the app. It automatically stays locked. So that's something that I do feel is very nice and something that more phones should have. I know Samsung does it. At least they did it back when I was still using Samsung phones. I wish that would just be a stock Android feature because it's something that's, especially with these phones that have a lot of RAM. Like, it really doesn't make sense that they'll sit here and throttle and like kill apps in the background when they don't need to. especially with how much more efficient Android has become and how much more efficient these chipsets have become. It just really doesn't make any sense. But yeah. Also, other things to talk about in terms of, it's not really an issue on this phone, but an issue on another Snapdragon 888 phone that I've used a lot, the S21 Ultra. The buffer on this phone, in terms of the camera, clears very fast. Like, that could be a mixture of like some Xiaomi magic that they're sprinkling on sprinkling in their phones, sprinkling on their motherboards or whatever. But that's not an issue on here because Sony is notorious for you half press to focus, you take the picture, you full press to take the picture, and it's instantly in there. Now there are instances where, say, you're at the full range of the software zoom, or like even a little bit more into the software zoom on the farthest part of the telephoto lens, and it will have to process a little bit beforehand. But when we're talking about just main sensor, or just not zooming at all with the 70 or the 105 millimeter focal lengths on the phone, it's fast and it focuses very well and really doesn't have any sort of problems there at all. So that's something that I do feel like is not really an issue on here. But when we're talking about, say, an S21 Ultra, the S21 Ultra, especially if you stay in like the 108 megapixel mode, it would take a bit to clear the buffer. And you couldn't sit there and just rapidly shoot off pictures. And I know people are like, well, why'd you do that? Well, say if you had a family function or you have kids or whatever, and you want to take a better shot in succession, sometimes it's easier to just be able to hit the shutter button again to capture that picture. And to me, that's something that you can do on a Sony and you can do on here as well. Now, I'm not saying you just like rapid fire it, but say you wait like half a second and then you can still do it, and this phone focuses very fast. Both of these phones have eye autofocus. I would say I like it a little bit better on the Xperia, mainly because once you have pressed the focus, it actually still shows you that it's focusing on somebody's eye, whereas on here, it'll show that it's focusing on someone's eye for like, say, 2 to 3 seconds, and then it'll go away. So that's something I do feel that Xiaomi should allow you to see. I wonder if I get the photography kit with the shutter button, if that would do anything, if that would have the same kind of, function, but ultimately we'll see. But it's nice to see eye autofocus on a phone that isn't a Sony phone. I'll say that much. Yeah. So going from 888 to Gen 2, and I suppose going to Gen 3 as well, which hopefully we're having these murmurs that Samsung is going back to doing the Gen 3, mainly because Apple bought up all the TSMC fabrication, which sucks. But hopefully Samsung has their shit together this time, because I wouldn't like there to be every other freaking year. I wouldn't like for it to be the case where, oh, you skip this generation because these phones get way too hot because Samsung doesn't know how to fabricate a chip. Like, I don't want that. I want there to be options, and I don't want there to be a lottery between whether or not, oh, are we getting TSMC this year? Are we getting Samsung this year? That just really doesn't make sense. But in terms of this upgrade, this is a definite upgrade if you're talking about heat, battery efficiency, things like that. And this phone really does give me inklings of an LG V60, and that's something that I really do like a lot. But I will touch on that in a separate video. This is Sparta. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the support. Hope you guys have a wonderful Tuesday, whatever time of day it is in the area. Have a good one.